May I speak in the name of our loving, liberating, and life-giving God. Amen. Please be seated. It was 1979. For years, the country's imagination had been captured by outer space. It had only been 15 years since people had been sent into space at all, and just 10 since Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin planted the American flag on the moon. But while most of the world had trained their heads heavenward, some were focused in the opposite direction, enthralled by the unknown, and for much of human history, unknowable, expanse of the oceans all around us. Curious adventurers had come up with creative ways to venture ever deeper, but divers faced two formidable challenges. First, of course, how to breathe, and second, the ever-increasing water pressure. In 1952, U.S. Major Christian Lambertson patented a modified version of a rebreather used for World War II missions that required extended submersion in water. He called it SCUBA, an acronym for Self-Contained Underwater Breathing Apparatus. But scientists and explorers alike were still limited by the kind of protective gear available. And it wasn't until the 1970s that hard, pressurized suits, essentially individual submarines, made deep-sea diving possible at all. And this is how the first person came to walk solo on the bottom of the ocean floor, a quarter of a mile down, 600 pounds of pressure per square inch, bearing down upon her shoulders. Oceanographer Sylvia Earle, a marine biologist and botanist by training, became affectionately known by fellow scientists as her deepness with this act. Having earned her master's and PhD from Duke University in the 50s and 60s, she was used to being the only woman in the class, in her field, or on the research team. So perhaps she was in her element as the only human in this unfamiliar landscape, this otherworldly inner space. As much as there are parallels between space exploration and deep-sea diving, one thing is distinctly different. Sylvia may have been the only woman down there, but she was definitely not alone. She describes this first historic dive in a recent interview as a fantastic adventure filled with unimaginable discoveries. She was captivated by the flash and sparkle and glow of bioluminescent creatures. Corals grew up around her like long, tall bed springs, and when she touched one, a ring of blue fire would pulse down its body to its base. She says the water itself was like minestrone, except all the little bits are alive. Her awe and wonder in the face of this wet and wild wilderness is contagious. But the wilderness is not always experienced as such a breathtakingly beautiful place, a place of inspiration and intrigue, particularly in the Bible. Today's reading from Numbers recounts some of the trials and traumas the people of Israel encountered as they journeyed through the wilderness, making their way from slavery in Egypt to new life in the Promised Land, which sounds great, except nothing had gone according to plan. They wanted to be free from the unbearable burden of Pharaoh's hand, but they didn't know this would mean wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. They quickly became impatient, asking Moses, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness?" Why indeed? There's no water, and the manna God is providing pales in comparison to the comforts and comfort foods of their previous lives, even if those lives were lived in chains. The people face harsh weather, unfamiliar terrain, and an unpredictable God, a God who provides, but remains a mystery nonetheless. Sometimes we find ourselves thrust into wildernesses of our own without a moment's notice. The phone rings and the routine test comes back with unwelcome results. Your spouse wants to talk, and with just a few words, the foundation of trust between you turns to dust. There's an accident or an assault, an unexpected betrayal or a relapse, and suddenly your world turns upside down. My guess is, to one degree or another, we all know what it feels like to find ourselves in an unfamiliar world. And this happens in our collective lives, as well as our individual ones. A family comes undone when someone comes out as gay or conservative or liberal or a Cal fan. A nation descends into the wilderness of fake news, the heartache of yet another shooting, the ground becoming quicksand in our confusion, shock, and dismay. But there are also times that we enter the wilderness with eyes wide open, perhaps not exactly looking forward to what lies ahead, but determined to see ourselves through. No one wants to need extensive therapy or land in a treatment center, but every once in a while, our willingness aligns with our circumstance, and we know that the other side of depression or addiction or whatever hell we find ourselves in lies on the other side of this desolate landscape, and there is nothing to do but put one foot in front of the other. Or maybe your work or your travels or your education have opened a door at the edge of your known world, which you suddenly recognize is no longer home. And as uncertain as you are of where you're going, you are determined or stubborn or desperate enough to trudge on. Or maybe you have an adventurer's heart and you just have to swim in the Minestrone Sea or watch moon dust slip between your fingers. During Lent, Christians are invited to voluntarily enter a wilderness of our choosing, taking on some new spiritual discipline and committing to it for 40 days, no matter what God or the world does with our hearts or our souls in the meantime, or giving up some worldly pleasure just to notice what that lack does in us, to observe and stay present to our unfulfilled longings and appetites, hopefully cultivating more patient, more skillful ways of being in this world. We fast from meat and injustice, from wine and indulgence, from Facebook and sharp tongues. But whether we find ourselves in the wilderness by chance or by choice, there will be, inevitably, times we are so scared we can barely breathe, like our oxygen is running out, or the snakes have circled around. There will be times of impatience and mind-numbing boredom. Whether we have been in the wilderness 40 years, or 40 days, or 40 seconds, we will be tempted to turn back or give up altogether. The wilderness can be a beautiful place, full of awe and wonder, but it is not a safe place, because the one thing that always happens there is that we change. We never come out on the other side the same person we were at the start. Christians in the first few centuries after Jesus' life, death, and resurrection understood this. For them, the wilderness was not just a place to sojourn from time to time. It was the unfamiliar territory in which they lived and moved and had their being. It was the place into which generations had been born and where generations were passing away, because their lives were never safe, never certain, never sure. At first, a grassroots movement of peace-loving Jews, Christianity quickly faced persecution from the same empire that had put Jesus himself to death, Rome. Early followers of the Way chose to live their lives in the wilderness when they chose to follow Jesus. Within just a few centuries, the boat had become an evocative symbol for this emerging community, representing the church tossed on a sea of disbelief, worldliness, and persecution, a vessel of salvation, seeing those aboard safely to a new life, a new world even. It was also a convenient symbol, as Christians often needed to disguise the shape of the cross, which can be easily hidden in most masts. But the boat not only said something about the church as an institution, but also the people within. Unlike a modern cruise, boats were not generally places of leisure in the ancient world. They were used for specific purposes and specific ends, to get places or provide food or keep a people safe. Everyone aboard had to work, and more importantly, they had to work together, making their way across the wild waters, the wilderness just below. People ate together, complained together, grew together, cried together, and whether they were there by chance or by choice, they were changed by these crossings. Just as earlier followers of this radical, peace-loving prophet Jesus were reformed and remade in their striving, their work, and their witness. This history resonates even today in the words we use to talk about our sacred spaces. The central portion of our sanctuaries, from about here back to that wall, are called naves, coming from the Latin word for ship, navis, which is also the root for words like navigate or navy. Today we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of this sacred space, this nave, which was actually explicitly designed with a boat in mind. I think it's most clear when you leave and look at the front of this space behind me, hanging over the waves of earth just above Border Road, like the bow of a ship. And here we are, 50 years later, or 2,000 years later, still working together, growing together, complaining together, crying together, eating together, always eating together, as we make our way through the wilderness of our world, across the sea of secularism, of disbelief, of doubt. Founded in 1379, New College, Oxford is among the older Oxford colleges. Like the others, it has a massive and inviting dining hall with large oak beams, up to 2 square feet around and 45 feet long, running across the ceiling. It also looks something like a nave. And it's a magical place. Think of the dining hall in the Harry Potter movies, and you won't be far off. At some point, in the early 20th century, those beams were found to have been overtaken by beetles. This unfortunate discovery was reported with some dismay. Beams as grand as those put in place some 600 years earlier were now very hard to come by. Eventually, the college forester was brought in and asked if there might be any oaks on the university property that could be felled to produce new ones. Legend has it that the forester took off his humble hat and said, "Well, we were wondering when you'd be asking about them." The forester explained that when the college was founded, those who had built it had anticipated the beams would eventually fail and had planted a large grove of oaks to replace them when the moment came. This knowledge had been passed down through generations of foresters, always with the admonition, "You don't cut them oaks, them's for the college hall." The foresight of the founders was providential, and new beams were produced from the trees destined for that purpose centuries ago. This delightful story, popularized by Oxford anthropologist Gregory Bateson, is a poignant reminder of our indebtedness to the generosity and foresight of those who came before us, those who built this campus, gave us these windows, founded Ventana, and simultaneously of our obligation to those yet to come, which always raises the question for those of us following the way in our time. As we worship and serve together, what legacy are we leaving those who will come after us? When the beams fail, or they find themselves at the edge of their wilderness, will they have something, a grove of trees, a depth of prayer, a financial gift, a sustaining spirit to see them across the stormy sea? Will they have a community here to come home to? A natural world as vibrant as it was when Sylvia Earle first took her walk on the ocean floor? Will they have reason to hope and to dream and to continue to venture into the unknown worlds beyond? We can resist the wilderness. We probably will. But if we are courageous enough to board this boat, the boat of that peace-loving radical prophet, well, we will never be alone again. And we will find the wilderness not only a place of refinement and refreshment, but of resurrection, until all of creation is redeemed and restored, and all our naves can be left on the shore. Amen.